Achtung, Achtung! Welcome to WWII's 12 Days of Christmas Guests, in which James and I talk to a famous face about their personal relationship with the Second World War. As you enjoy another day of turkey leftovers, have a listen to restaurateur Jack Stein about rations in the Second World War. Achtung, Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, James Holland. Should we call, are they specials? Some of them have been special. So, James, who are we talking to today?
It's part of the Stein fraternity. It is Jack Stein. Jack, great to see you. And I knew we were going to hit it off because I met you at a cricket match and we talked cricket and then we talked about the Second World War and then we talked about food. And it was just, we had that fantastic conversation, didn't we, after the match?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. This podcast is it was the first podcast I ever found that there were so many episodes to go back to. You know, it got me through all the lockdowns. So thank you guys. It's been a pleasure to come on the journey, and I've almost caught up, but there is just so much there. So thanks for having me on.
Oh well, thanks very much for joining us. Sorry if I'm a little hoarse, as I was shouting at Argentina and the Netherlands last night.
No problems. Yeah, now I'm in my 40s. Obviously, as most 40-year-old men do, they become very fascinated by the Second World War. So, it's just I'm just one of those. You know, I am that man. What did
40-year-old men get into before the Second World War? Was it Napoleon? I suppose, but was there a long enough gap for that to sort of occur? Because that's the. I mean, because that is the joke, isn't it? That middle-aged men either take a mistress or take an interest in the operational level or something.
I just think before the Second World War, they just accepted boring, mundane, middle-aged life. That's just the way it is. That by that stage, you really do have your pipe and slippers, and you're a total conformist. And if you're not, then obviously you're a social leper.
But also the sort of your life expectancy was a lot shorter, so you're probably retired.
So a philosophical tilt we're on to start with.
There we go.
but Jack, when we were talking, you were talking with wonderment about the Kangaroo Route, weren't you? The Qantas set up, fly from Australia to Singapore, and in the war they kept it going, didn't they? They were going to Ceylon and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So two places are very close to my heart. I love cricket and love surfing. So my wife's from Western Australia. She's from Perth. And I go to Sri Lanka a lot to watch cricket and to surf. And there's a place there, Lake Kogala, which has got a military air base next to, and we sort of always stay nearby it. My tuk-tuk driver lives like on the banks of it. And we were in Perth one day, just sort of like looking out at the Swan River there, sort of the Wacker in the background, that horrible place that we just don't talk about. And my father-in-law, who's Sicilian, who'd come over in the 50s from Sicily, started going on about this plane, this seaplane, that used to fly to Sri Lanka from Perth. And I was like, nah, come on, what are you talking about? There's no, I mean, how could you, in 1943 or whenever it was, how could you possibly stay aboard that? He's like, they call it the double sunrise because the pilots would see two sunrises. They'd be in the air for 35 hours. And I was like, it's basically a Catalina with, it's a petrol tank with wings. And that's how I first heard about it. But apparently it served a really important function of taking sort of letters and information from Australia, which was obviously quite important part of the Pacific theatre for both sides. To I've been to Darwin a few times and learned about the sort of bombings up there. And I spent some time. I know you have too, James, in the Solomon Islands. I spent 6 months out there, and that sort of whole trying to get the control of the Pacific in Australia was a big part of that. And these planes were taking messages from basically, what was then unoccupied Australia through the Japanese territories and up to Sri Lanka. And then they could then pass those messages on to the British, which is incredible. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, that is absolutely amazing.
This idea of flying from first to Singapore from Brisbane was pioneered by Qantas, which is the oldest airliner air service in the world, weirdly. I think it was founded in 1920 or 1922 or something. And they set it up in 1935 with these DH-86s, these Haviland 86s, which were kind of sort of biplane passenger planes. And the extraordinary thing about them is obviously the tickets were incredibly expensive. It took an incredibly long time, and it was really, really dangerous. And lots of them just kept crashing. But rather than sort of ground the route and kind of go, okay, well, there's a message here that this is just too dangerous to operate, they just cracked on. But what it meant was that by the start of the war, this idea of doing really long distance routes was already up and running. So they had the form effectively. And they just kept it going, and then they kind of expanded it to Ceylon, and you had, as you say, you had the double sunrise.
Yeah, I've listened to a couple of things online. One of the surviving pilots, Rex Senior, talking about this, and when you think, the Swan River, they had to fly down it to try and get enough height to get over the Fremantle Bridge, which isn't a big bridge, but they were so full of petrol. And he tells a story about going up to the American base up at Geraldton and asking for some. They had about, I don't know, 9,000 litres of fuel. And they're like, can we get, 9,000 litres of fuel? And they're like, what are you doing with that? And he was like, oh, just selling it. They're like, fair enough, and just gave it to him. But this thing would they would fly over at 1,500 feet. And then on the way back, they'd come back at 12,000 feet with no oxygen. And as far as I can tell, they made nearly 300 crossings. And they didn't actually lose a single plane. But they were navigating by the stars. They had no radios. They had to whip out all the insulation.
God, incredible.
It's like, I hate flying. I couldn't. It's one of my. I have to fly. I absolutely hate it. And the idea of flying in a petrol bomb on with wings, just oh god. Good.
let alone sort of Catalinas, which were, of course, came in during the, that they started to use in the war. They had Liberators as well. They were using Liberators for this route. But you're right. It's absolutely astonishing because it's a long way now, but it's a really long way from 1943, which is when they start running the specific double sunrise route.
How often did it run? Are we talking, once a week or?
Yeah, I think it was weekly. Yeah, once it was. I mean, the British MP was one of the passengers on it. They took about 800 passengers across the whole piece. But Edith Summershell, never heard of her, but she apparently was one of the passengers. They were given a certificate called the Double Sunrise Certificate when they landed successfully. Right. But just to think, you're taking off from a river and you're landing in a lake and you're going across the Indian Ocean and you're going across that bit of the Indian Ocean where they were looking for the Malaysian Airlines. Yeah. It was some of the roughest conditions. I mean, hitting cyclones daily. And this surviving pilot, or he's not surviving anymore, but when he was speaking, he was saying that, you had no pre-warning of a cyclone. You'd just be like, oh, there's one. And you go, none of this kind of a radar or anything that the airline pilots have these days. And it was, pretty rough. I mean, just absolutely astonishing. But what I was wondering is, what were they taking? What would these letters have been? Would it have been intelligence, or, what would it have been? Not just love letters, I'm assuming.
Well, it's official letters and official papers. But it absolutely is also love letters, and it's absolutely vital to morale. I mean, even the Nazis recognise that, and they don't really care about that. And the timing's absolutely everything, because you want to be flying over Japanese occupied territory at night.
Yeah.
In darkness.
Yeah.
Which also means, as you point out, Jack, that you're then flying over sort of treacherous seas at the same, at the same time. They started off with these 5 Catalinas that they used, and then they later progressed away from seaplanes, but also onto these very long-range Liberators. But the problem with the Catalinas is you've got to strip everything out inside, because obviously you've got to take on a vast amount of extra fuel that you wouldn't normally expect to take. So by the time it's actually taking off with all the mail bags and all the extra fuel, it's also incredibly heavy. And so it is a seaplane, Catalina, so getting it off the sea in the first place is not an easy task. I mean, the whole thing is just fraught with unbelievable danger.
Well, there's that fine line, isn't there? You need a headwind to fly into, so you need it going in the right direction, but you need it not too strong that it's making the sea choppy and making things difficult. I remember my grandfather telling me about, he flew, I think, to Alexandria in a Sunderland at some point, and him telling me about them not being able to get out of Gibraltar because the weather was so bad. And basically, they taxied out. Everyone like you're in a boat, smashed about in the water. The pilot tried to take off, couldn't. They went back round. They taxied again, and this is all with the motion of a boat rather than of an air, just taxiing as an aircraft. They went round again, and the pilot said, "Well, we've blown too much fuel on that. We're going to have to refuel." And so they stayed the night, tried again in the morning. Or tried again at dawn or whatever. It just all sounds...
Well, but Gibraltar killed many a good pilot, didn't it? And people, because the runway was so short. So as soon as you try to put anything of any size on it, there was always a chance you were going to not take off and just end up straight in the sea. And weirdly, that's what happened to Screwball Burling. So he'd survived Malta. He'd become the kind of quickest, highest scoring ace for the Allies in the summer of 1942, and then he was sort of shipped back to Britain. And when they got to Gibraltar, his plane crashed. That he wasn't piloting; he was just a passenger. He was in hospital for 6 months.
I actually went when I was filming a TV show in Australia. I went to Darwin. I learned about the raid on Darwin and things like that. And then afterwards, we went to a brewery, which I was extremely happy about. So we filmed this kind of this microbrewery, and then they like to surprise me on the show. They're like, right, we're going to fly up to the Pearl Farm, which is 2 hours sort of into absolutely nowhere. You couldn't be in a more further away from civilization. And we flew on a Grumman Mallard, which was a seaplane built in 1947. Bearing in mind, I like to fly on planes that were built in like 2020, with all the flyby. Anything older than that, I look at a 747 these days, I'm going, not sure about that. Anyway, and this bloke was going, oh, it's brilliant. It's just like flying in an E-type Jag. And I'm going, it's not really though, is it? Because E-type Jags don't take off from the water and land on the water. And we went in this thing, and the film crew thought it would be hilarious to sort of put a GoPro on my head so they could film the abject fear as we sort of swung in onto this like tiny little. It was so strange. It was like this tiny little pearl farm, but it was like a Bond villain's lair, because pearls, they had all these models out there that were filming like doing this modelly shoot, and they had all these guys running around in high vis, and the guy who ran it was very kind of authoritarian. So we landed as a film crew, a load of models kind of doing this kind of modelly stuff, the kind of crew that were manning this island palace thing, and I was just like, this is bizarre, get me back on that plane, get me out of here. Another thing I wanted to just briefly touch on, so I know you went to the Solomons, James, I remember you, so I was actually out there for quite a while, doing some like charity work, and we went and saw all the sites. So you were on
Guadalcanal, were you? Or were you a different one?
We were, and then we went over to Suva. Is it called
Suva Island?
Where yes, and we went to the place. So we actually learned to dive where JFK's PT-109 was sunk. And then I was talking about the importance of messages. I know you obviously know the story. The guy, they gave some guys a coconut fashioned on the back where they were, and they paddled off on canoes into the mangroves where there are a lot of crocodiles. I mean, there's so many crocodiles out there. I never expected. I'm a surfer, and I was surfing in the water one day, and the local paddled up to me and said, "We got to get out because this is when the crocodiles feed on the reef." And I'm like, "I'll take my chance with a shark any day of the week. Crocodile, I'm not going anywhere near it." So yeah, and then we met the guy. I mean, he was still alive. The guy that was one of the guys that paddled this coconut with their location back to the American base, and he has this bright orange T-shirt on that said, "I saved JFK," and I'm pretty sure not many tourists come through that part of the Solomon Islands, it has to be said. So I think when they know that a tourist are coming, he probably whips it out and puts it on. But yeah, a fascinating guy. But that whole area, that battle, the Crocodile River, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, Alligator Creek, that's it. Yeah,
that's it. And it was, we were there, and it was the most amazing place. Quite tough to travel around, it has to be said. But
it's not easy, is it?
No. And then we sort of we did a bit of diving over some Japanese transporters, and we were down in one.
So were you diving on Iron Bottom Sound?
No, because a lot of those wrecks are too deep. So on Suva there's a couple that are a bit closer to the shore. We went through a Japanese transport that had been torpedoed, and then down at the bottom there was a small tank, and then there was bottles of beer, there was condoms, there was all sorts. It's so strange, to have these Japanese military issued condoms still there at the bottom. Yeah, it's
yeah, it really, really is. I really like Guadalcanal, and I really like all the people. Though it's they all chew that betel nut stuff. So they've all got incredibly. It looks like they've got lipstick on. They've got incredibly bright red lips. And if they're kind of over 30, all their teeth are just completely black. But what is absolutely for sure is that the Health and Safety Executive has not reached Guadalcanal in any shape or form, not only with betel nut, but also with the huge amount of ordnance that's still there.
Well, it's because they mix it with lime, don't they? Which is the same lime that you would put on grave sites. So it decays the flesh of the lips. So that, I mean, we went up and looked at some of the tunnels, and there's like every like sort of small house has got like half a tank or a machine gun in the back garden. I mean, it's incredible. It's quite a funny story actually. So I was working with an NGO that is attached to the hospital, and the lady there, they have these Wontok tribal systems, and they'll have their individual rules. And this lady was a doctor, so she's in Honiara, and she had this lovely house. But because of her tribal system, the Wontok system that they had meant that you have to share everything. So every weekend, all the lads from the village would come down, just get out on the lash, and she'd had enough of it because she's working in the hospital, and so she built another house with only one door, because in their Wontok tribe, a man and woman can't share the same door. So once she'd built a house with only one door, they didn't come down anymore, and she was free every weekend from just these lads partying.
Amazing.
Funny. But I remember sort of being taken up to Galloping Horse, and I had a kind of a local guide. He was just some lad chewing betel nut with no shoes on, and he just led me up this path. And what I didn't realise was that that was like my first day out there, where all the film crew were doing something else. And then first thing the following morning, I had to have this safety briefing from a mine clearing guy, who then told me, under no circumstances should you be walking anywhere on Guadalcanal without them and their metal detectors and all the kit they've got for kind of finding ordnance. And I've been sort of picking up bullets and, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, just don't do it, people.
Well, I mean, when I went to Croatia a long time ago, we'd had that mine briefing, and I was in Sarajevo, and the other comedian and I realised we were walking up a disused railway line by ourselves, which was plainly exactly the place we weren't supposed to be, that would be booby-trapped and mined. And you think, oh, bollocks, this was a mistake. Well, I mean, fortunately, I lived to tell the tale, but it is that thing of, it seems like a normal place, and then you realise it's actually brimful of crap and ordnance and things designed to kill you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I remember also going across the Alamein battlefield with a inverted commas Bedouin guide who clearly wasn't a Bedouin and clearly wasn't a guide and had never been there before. And I knew perfectly well where we were, and it wasn't where we should be, and that was quite tense. But again, I lived to tell the tale, I'm glad to say.
Another thing we did recently is we, because my family's German, it's been really interesting listening to some of the podcasts that you've done, talking to people who've got families in Germany. And so our family was German.
Yes, you've got this family in Dusseldorf, haven't you?
Yeah. So my dad's grandpa, he moved over. So it's quite an interesting story. So they were brewers. So our family made alcohol, and in the late, sort of 1880s, the father sent all of his sons to different parts of the world. So my great granddad, whatever, where he came to London to learn about gin. Another one went to Kentucky. Another one went to Scotland. Like, they were basically like looking at different types of spirits, like research. So anyway, he got to London, and then wrote back to his father and said, I'm not coming home because I think alcohol is of the past. And petroleum had just started to come into kind of, into view. And he said, I think the next century is going to be about this. And then he founded a company that would later become BP. Unfortunately, he sold it very early because, but so he stayed in London, and obviously, that's our lineage. But we went back to Dusseldorf, where our family were from. And it was we had this 250 room massive hotel, just near it, sort of just in the Rhineland somewhere, a little bit out of Dusseldorf. And anyway, but it was this amazing experience of having the generation of the war who were all sort of dying out, but literally doing lectures on what we did in the war. And it was incredibly moving. I mean, it was, it was very, look, we need to tell everything that happened with our families, the Steins, the Schmidts. And obviously we were in alcohol and fermentation. So I think our kind of factories were reconstituted for making, I think like petrol or diesel or something, some sort of like chemical that would help the war effort, and the Smiths were doing machine parts, and it was so strange because we had gone over there. Typical Brits, don't mention the war, this kind of stuff. We got there and we didn't expect it to be quite the way it was, but it was this massive free lectures. Every hour there's another lecture about what we actually did, where we were positioned, and we weren't like, they weren't Nazis by any stretch of imagination. They were just in industry, so they were repurposed for the war, and it was incredibly moving. It was also a bit like in The Simpsons when the Ned Flanders all meet the family of Ned Flanders. It was like all these Germans that look exactly like our family, a very strong sort of Germanic genes going through our family or something. Because I was like, it looks like about 18 dads over there and 6 of my Uncle John, and this, that, and the other. But it was very, I don't know, it was just like an incredibly moving experience for us all. Because when you've got a family that's split between the two countries during the First and Second World Wars, or it's sort of you think, well, what did we do? And we found out, and it was really moving.
Gosh, that's fascinating.
What an extraordinary thing. There's that Stephen Polyakov film, isn't there, where there's a family reunion and it's just unexpected stories from the past and emerge. But I'm quite envious of Al's wartime family heritage because I don't really have any. But I've got to say that sort of trumps it, really. I mean, that's properly good.
Yeah, it's sort of, it was good that we didn't turn up any really bad sort of, anything particularly bad. But there was a picture of a wedding, and Goebbels was a guest at the wedding. So it was, at that point, it was getting a little bit close to maybe the last lecture is going to be, this kind of big revelation of what what we did, what none of us really wanted to hear. But as it happened, it was
part
just
of the Nazi inner circle.
Yeah, friend of a friend. Having just got married myself, there was a couple of people at my wedding I didn't really know, so I just like to hope that was probably, maybe it was a wedding crasher.
Yeah, the Goebbels had just kind of turned up.
Well, I suppose if Goebbels turned up, you'd have to find him a seat, wouldn't you? He turned up at your wedding. You wouldn't really be able to get around that. There must actually be plenty of families with where they bifurcate at some point in the 20th century, and you could argue the royal family have got exactly the same issue.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I guess in the turn of the 20th century, it was Germany was a high point in culture and all that sort of stuff, and London was the two would have been intermingling a bit. It must have been quite difficult for families who were still quite German, as I imagine my family were at the time, being the first generation to settle. They would have had the accent and spoke German as a first language. For then, during the First World War, it would have been really quite difficult. And I guess that's why I think the royal family changed their name, didn't they? I guess because and lots of families did. I don't think ours did, but then I don't know. Maybe we were making too much petrol. I'm not sure. Maybe they called it British Petroleum to hide behind the.
I mean, I have to say, I wish I had that kind of business now to spot the next petrol, whatever it is.
I know, but it's a bit like spotting the next pet. It's like spotting Facebook and then selling it in the second day to Bono or whatever, One of the funny things the bit about the German family is they also set up the first alcohol rehabilitation clinic in Europe ever. So they were making the stuff, selling it, getting everyone plastered, and then giving them rehab and sending them back out on their way to buy more. It's just, I said to Dad, it's a bit like the lobster hatchery down in Padstow, where they hatch little lobsters and set them out, and then we buy them, we sell them, and then we get them again.
But Jack, I've got to tell you, we're sort of half thinking. No, I'm going to say we are thinking because I've got to. You can sense that I'm weakening on this, but I mustn't. I must be strong. We're thinking of doing a 1940s rationing diet for Lent.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to follow it.
We try.
Yeah, we're going to do the wartime diet. We're going to pioneer it. And actually, it's going to make us rich because we're going to do diet books, which are going to rival all the biggest that have ever been produced.
Yeah.
Well, it's sort of like a paleo book, those great diets of the Paleolithic era where people died at 20. Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah.
No, this is the diet that won us the Second World War, Jack. That's the idea,
That's the point. It's delivering victory.
I thought that was logistics.
Well, it is logistics. Well done. It is logistics because by producing more food at home and making sure that everyone had a balanced diet, you had a stronger, better, healthier workforce, but also you could free up shipping space for other things other than grain and from North America and meat from the Argentine, etc.
So what was rationed then? What sort of things would have been rationed?
Well, rationing changed as the war progressed, and so it only came in January 1940, and I'm very much in favour of doing the 40 diet rather than the 43 to 45 one, which was a bit more stringent. So bread was never rationed, sugar was, meat was, not least because a lot of the meat did come from the Argentine, and obviously you don't want to use shipping space transporting meat from Argentina, but also a lot of bacon came from places like Denmark, of course. And when Europe was cut off, in May, June 1940, that was that. All those markets were just suddenly closed to Britain. So it was all about cereals, really, and about growing your own veg. This is the whole kind of dig for victory idea. So that even if it doesn't matter how small your garden is, you dig it up and you grow veg. So obviously the sort of things that are short are overseas fruit, but you can have as many apples you can grow and eat. That's brilliant. And of course, the great thing about apples is you can actually store them throughout the winter if you're careful. You can pickle stuff and you can dry store apples, and they're all right, and cook them up. This
sounds like the menu of a sort of Scandinavian Michelin restaurant. This does, overwintering and clamping and things like that.
And a game, game isn't rationed. It's interesting. Fish isn't, but the price goes up as the war runs. So, and bread isn't. It's interesting that bread isn't rationed until after the war. That it's the Labour government austerity that ration, post-war debt paying that ends up rationing bread. It's fascinating.
Well, I mean, I do remember somebody being interviewed in Wiltshire about Brexit, saying that we could maybe do this kind of thing to help with Brexit, which I thought was an interesting take on putting in economic sanctions on yourself. That we could all plant food in our gardens. To look at the guy, I would say he was probably not going to be the first person to try it, but who knows? But wasn't there something? I'm sure I read something about that there was a sort of a health benefit almost. I know it sounds terrible in wartime, but of this sort of diet. I remember seeing there was a bit of an uptick in longevity of people that had been through it, or something along those lines.
Absolutely, but British people have never been healthier because the whole point was that everyone would get a balanced diet. It prevents people from stockpiling and hoarding, and they were very sensible that if you had sort of hard physical labour in the fields or in a factory or whatever, then you got a little bit more, and it meant that even the poorest were eating reasonably well. That was the point about it. And of course, if you're eating well, you've got a really good balanced diet, then you're less likely to get ill. And if you're less likely to get ill, then you can do more man hours in your factory, which means your productivity goes up.
Yeah.
Sounds like communism to me, James.
Well, I mean, this is why a lot of people are quite keen on it. I mean, restaurants were from May 1942. Restaurants were limited to 3 courses.
That's pretty bad, isn't it? I mean, it's come to that.
Only one component dish could contain fish or game or poultry, but not more than one of these. So that's a vegetarian starter and a conventional pudding, isn't it?
Honestly, Al, that sounds like the conversations we're having at the moment on our menus. Honestly, with the economic situations for next year, it's basically like one fish, one meat, one vegetarian. That's about it.
Yeah. Well, no meals between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. without a special license.
No kebabs then.
The maximum price of a meal, 5 shillings, which is roughly the equivalent of 12 quid now.
But what was happening because I wasn't the London restaurant scenes are sort of the big. I remember listening was probably your podcast talking about people who were staying in London that were high value people staying in the Ritz and the Dorchester or whatever. Claridge's was a big one, wasn't it? Yeah. So were they still serving all their usual kind of foie gras and sort of first growth, claret, or was it very restricted to them?
Don't forget these leading restaurants, they have huge cellars. So enough to kind of last them 5 years. So, and obviously the amount of dining is going down. So the weekly stress on the cellar is not as great. But stuff that you've already got isn't rationed. It's stuff in the moment that's rationed. So you just, and there are ways of doing things. As you say, there's, game is still perfectly acceptable. So, if you know someone who's got an estate in Scotland and can get you some venison, then, happy days. It's as simple as that. Well,
I think you could write. I mean, to be honest, if you were looking, I joke about the Scandinavian restaurants, but places like Noma, best restaurant in the world, as voted for by people that like lists, they have this very focused local, like they don't have any chocolate, any sugar or anything like that, nothing imported, and no berries that don't come from, a reindeer's arsehole, sort of that sort of thing. And a lot of lichens and mosses. But actually, I think if you're looking at rationing and actually using that as a kind of way of saying, right, what can we get seasonally and what can we do, say, to overwinter stuff? Like you're saying, pickling, salting, and clamping. I don't know if you know what clamping is, when you take vegetables and you bury them in sand, and they basically preserve them through the winter.
Wow.
Yeah, so you can things like beetroots, carrots, and potatoes and things like that. You basically pick them, so they stop growing, and then you basically put them in sand, and they don't ferment. It's very cool, but it does give this amazing flavour, because they do, obviously they slightly shrink and intensify in flavour. So I think there's a really good menu that you could do, which basically focuses in on the things you can get. So obviously the game, some fish, some of the seasonal stuff, but also how you might extend those things through the winter. And that, and again, the classic one people always will use is, Italians don't use tomatoes in winter. They use tomatoes that they've grown in summer that they've put into jars and they've preserved. But Brits thinking, we have this kind of 365 days of the year kind of larder of everything we want flown in from wherever it needs to come from. Yeah. We think of, fresh tomatoes in February as being great, even though they taste of absolutely nothing. But actually, so I think the idea of looking at that as a menu and what you could do for a period of time, I think it'd be intellectually interesting as a chef, I think, because you were really kind of not able to reach for things that you'd normally reach for to get flavour. So you would be like looking at a lot of like pickling and fermenting and things like. And obviously, I don't know how much sauerkraut would go down well in wartime Britain, but things like kimchi and things like that. There's other ways around it, but you can make some fantastic tasting stuff from stuff that you can grow. And I don't know if you actually. I tried to grow stuff during lockdown and gave up and just listened to this podcast. So, there's a veg patch out the back and a bit of sourdough starter in the freezer that I never did anything with. So I think it'd be really interesting.
The things that are rationed right from the word go are bacon, butter, and sugar, and then later it's all meat, tea, jam, cheese, eggs, lard, milk, canned food. All that stuff is all rationed. I think if we just went for kind of rationing, actually, in retrospect, we're thinking about it. If we just went for the kind of no sugar, butter, and bacon, I don't think it's much of a diet, to be honest. But it's interesting because you can have as much bread as you like. That's never rationed, and as I say, you can have as much veg as you like.
Yeah, but exactly, and game as well. I think game is in this era of mass meat production and and kind of all the sustainability issues that come with it, all that. Game is the one kind of thing that I think shines through, and so it as like a good alternative if you do have ethical concerns about how much meat you're eating. Game is fantastic because it's grown, it grows wild all over the country, and and supports local communities where it's caught or shot, as it's more commonly called, and so I think that'd be really interesting too.
The more we talk about this, Jim, and especially talking to someone who knows about food and how food works, I was faintly dreading it because
now we're getting quite excited, aren't we?
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, whether we recreate appalling wartime margarines and all that sort of thing to
a bit of butter. That's the point. I mean, you can. I just think you've got to think of something a little bit more. You can't sort of lather it with olive oil because No one had olive oil in 1940.
Yeah, but when it comes to butter, my problem is because I did Hell's Kitchen 16 years ago. I was taught to basically put half a pat of butter into everything I cooked, and
Yes.
and I've had to gradually tickle myself out of that.
Well, you're going to have to tickle yourself out of it a little bit more if we're going to be serious.
Well, I
players
won't be able to
of this.
make my tarte tatin, put it that way, with 250 grams of sugar and 250 grams of butter.
No, but you'll be able to do. I don't know what else you could do with your apple. Well, you just have to eat them raw.
Are you going to sort of do? I mean, I was just thinking then, like, if you wanted to have venison, maybe you have to go on a 20-mile walk before to sort of simulate stalking it. Maybe that could you get a bit of sort of live history, and
I like that. Go to Richmond Park and
walk around Hogarth's Gardens. Go up Staveley Road and look at the V2 site, which I do. My dad lives just down the road from it, so I took my wife there, and she was like, "Oh yeah, it's just like a suburban road."
That's the point. I mean, that is just around the corner from here. And many a child of mine. Well, I mean, that makes me sound like Boris Johnson. My children have been boringly reminded of that every time we're in the vicinity. Hey, you know what happened here? There was a bus going by, wasn't there? That's the thing. It was a major tragedy. Anyway, but yes, I'm warming to this idea, Jim. Actually, I also think because it's spring. If we're doing it in Lent, it'll be spring. So if we relied on the sort of seasonal changes, things may come good by Easter. In a way that if we were doing it now and you're going into Christmas on this rationing, that might be pretty miserable.
Yeah, when is Lent 2023?
March, is it?
Wednesday the 22nd of February to Thursday the 6th of April. That's not so bad, is it?
No, it's tough. It's because they call it the hunger gap. So we work with a couple of farmers down here in Cornwall, and they are literally like February there's nothing in the ground. There's a few clamped beetroots and a bit of potato and some kales, and that's pretty much a lot. It's a really tough time. So yeah, if you've got a greenhouse, maybe start planting something in it now.
Yeah, well, I think I can still buy veg. There's a local veg place, and obviously they'll still be presumably still doing leeks. Just about, I don't know.
Well, I think it would be interesting. I think I guess you're going to go to your greengrocer and say, I can only buy stuff that's been grown in the UK.
Yeah,
is that right? Yeah.
Okay.
And you can only buy game that's been shot in the UK.
Yeah.
Fish wasn't rationed, incidentally. Fish wasn't rationed at all.
Happy days. It's just really expensive, but do you have a budget, do you? Do you have a budget for it?
God, no, hell no.
Good. No. All right, well, let's get turbot.
We'll have to treat ourselves once a week.
We'll have 6 turbots a week.
Yeah, exactly.
18 lobsters.
Yeah, you can have all that.
It was quite funny not funny because it was a terrible time, but during the COVID lockdowns, there was obviously fishermen going out and getting lobsters down in Padstow, and it was really hot. Remember that first lockdown was really nice weather.
It was lovely, wasn't it, May, June?
Yeah. Go down to town with like 20 quid cash, and just a lobster fisherman would come up to you, and you'd be like, and you get like 4 lobsters for 20 quid, and we'd go back and I'd be like, I'm not putting this up on my social media because there's people having an absolute nightmare. They can't even get to the park, and there's me just walking around Padstow with this, these, and it was so quiet that they'd brought all of their pots into the harbour, so all their holding pots were just in the harbour. So they'd literally pull the pot up and just fish them out.
How amazing!
Yeah, and I phoned up the old man. I said, because he was in Australia, he was stuck out there. And I said, honestly, it's it's 20 degrees. It's 6 in the morning, 7 in the morning, whatever. It's a beautiful day. I'm buying lobsters for cash. He goes, it's like the 1960s all over again.
But it's not like the 1940s where, you
absolutely.
You could be pulling up a mine rather than a lobster.
It's I mean, I definitely think that you've got. I think it'd be a really interesting thing to do.
To play with here.
Yeah, I do, and I think also it's sort of I think, not saying that this is going to be a positive, but people buying more British, I think is, despite which way you voted in a recent referendum, people often Brexiteers, they often say we need to buy more British. maybe it would help with that. I mean, we've been trying to make this argument for fish and shellfish for a long time, that, if we could keep more of it in the UK, that's maybe a positive for the fishermen. But it seems a bit of a mess to me, to be honest. But yeah, maybe this could sort of help listeners kind of think about what they might be able to do for themselves with regards to buying more British stuff, because just finding out what is seasonal at that time of the year, February, March, is quite tough. But there's a lot of game about, and there's a few Brussels sprouts, and you're eating a lot of beetroot and kale, and not a lot of sugar.
I really like beetroot. I really, really like it, and it's one of those things that lots of people don't. We subscribe to, what was it, Life on the Veg? What's that on? Riverford,
yeah.
And they were always getting beetroot, and Rachel would just look at me and go, "Well, here's your beetroot. Well done. This really is time to knock this on the head."
See, I hate beetroot. So I mean,
I did hate it.
You're talking me back out of this whole thing now.
No. But I did hate it. But then I got really into it. Now I really, really like it. I think you should give it another go.
It's funny, though, because for some reason, and I'm sure there'll be Australian listeners out there that disagree, but Australians seem to universally like it. Yeah. They have it on everything, on burgers, and it's like, a whole nation is under the spell of one kind of, one vegetable. It's unbelievable. And
yes, yeah, their sort of fancy amped up burger in their equivalent to Burger King is a burger with a beetroot in it.
Yeah.
I did not know that about the Aussies. That's
horrible. Absolutely disgusting.
Well, there'll be loads of correspondents saying I'm Australian and I don't like it, but my wife and all of her family and all of my dad's wife's family, they just constantly putting beetroot on everything, which I don't mind beetroot, but it's it's just weird, because I think in this country it's a bit of a Marmite thing. People either love it or they hate it.
Well, I did hate it, but I've come around to it. I've gone from one extreme.
Well, I'm going to have to lump it. I'm going to have to lump it for Lent, aren't I?
Lump it for Lent. Well, but I think there's fun to be had from going around and finding, as you say, Jack, is finding out what's there. What's available. Going to your fruit and veg cellar.
Yeah, and having that's where the sort of comparison with the Scandinavian sort of reindeer moss restaurants is that they use it as very much an intellectual kind of thing for their menus, to kind of almost like, because it's easy these days to just reach for stuff that comes from all over the place, but actually to think about really what the people in Britain would have faced, the reality of what they could get in February, March, I think it would be really interesting. I think it would make some really interesting kind of conversations and some interesting meals for sure.
Yeah. We're talking 6 weeks, aren't we? This is the.
You can do it for 6 weeks.
Well, it's 40 days, isn't it? Lent is. Yeah.
Oh God, I thought it was just a weekend. I didn't. Sorry, I must have missed that. Yeah.
Just a weekend of beetroot.
Good luck.
It's 40 days. 40 days of beetroot. Oh, it's going to be great. I'm absolutely pumped for it, and I'm totally up for it.
Is alcohol rationed?
A beer isn't rationed.
No, beer's not rationed.
But booze is hard to come by. Yeah, anything in.
But the whole point is to get me in limbo, get me into shape for the cricket season. That's the whole point of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah,
exactly. So I actually would quite like to lose some weight, to be honest.
I think you look good, James. You had a few good shots.
All right. But I put on my 1930s suit the other day, and the good thing about it is it's a sharp look. The bad thing about it is that the trousers comes up to your belly button, and it was tougher to bring it, draw the two parts together, I've got to say. I mean, I suddenly thought, bloody hell, since July, the last time I wore this is I've put on a few pounds.
Well, it's just that pre-Christmas period, there's a bit of festive weight gain, and yeah, it's probably be quite good, quite cathartic in February to sort of, February is always a different, January is always, you get up to that kind of, Christmas is great fun, and then January everyone turns vegan or goes to the gym for half a day, and then somebody points out that today is the most depressing day of the year, and you're going, oh Jesus,
okay.
And then
I will finish off that bowl of Lindt chocolate then.
Yeah. And then I'm in Australia for that period, so I'll be eating lots of beetroot, but also sunning myself and trying to play cricket.
Australian Christmases are unnatural and against.
Well,
against
that's why
God.
we're flying out on the 27th. Yeah, the old man says, we're not having a barbecue on Bondi. It's not happening.
So when do you get back then?
So I'll be back in February, early February.
Right. Okay, so just in time to guide us through our trauma.
Absolutely.
Well, Jack, thanks so much for taking time out to talk to us. So you're a busy man, and Yeah, I think we reconvene in February where you present us with an appalling menu
Absolutely.
of roots and grubs.
Maybe something for the We Have Ways Festival. I was talking to Nick about it the other day. It'd be great. Maybe we could do a little cooking demonstration of what we did ration-wise for the menu.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
Well, we'd absolutely love that. We
That'd be
would
brilliant.
absolutely love that. It'd be amazing. Yes,
Fantastic.
please.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. We've been talking to Jack Stein. We hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.